The street lights flickered weakly, casting long, uneven shadows over the cracked pavement of the neighborhood. The wind whispered through the narrow alleys, carrying the faint sound of distant laughter. It was a poor area, where dreams were as scarce as money, and hopes often got buried beneath the weight of daily struggles. But for Kaio, 13 years old and slight in build, the rundown basketball court was more than just a patch of old concrete surrounded by rusty fences. It was his world. Clutching his worn basketball in his hands, Kaio stood at the edge of the court, watching the older boys play. They were taller, stronger, and always in control of the game. He wanted to be out there, playing alongside them, but they never gave him the chance. Every time he approached, they laughed him off, making it clear he didn't belong. "Hey, short stuff, Pedro," one of the older boys called out, his voice laced with mockery. "Get out of here, kid. This court isn't for midgets." The others laughed, and Kaio felt the familiar sting of humiliation. He could feel his cheeks burn as the heat of frustration and embarrassment rose inside him. Shorty, too small, weakling. The insults followed him like a shadow, but he never let them see how much it hurt. Instead, he held his head high, though his heart ached with the need to prove them wrong. He loved basketball more than anything, and while they mocked and dismissed him, he practiced in secret, late at night, when the court was empty and the streets were silent. He knew every move, every play by heart. Not because he played with the others, but because he spent hours alone, perfecting his technique in the shadows. The boys were playing a fast-paced game, dribbling, passing, and taking shots with ease. Kaio watched every movement, absorbing it all like a sponge. He had seen them play countless times, memorizing their tricks and skills. He knew he could compete with them if they just let him try. He sighed, gripping the ball tighter. The court felt like it was his, and yet the older boys kept shutting him out. Their mocking eyes and sneers were a constant reminder that, to them, he was just a small, poor kid who would never make it. "You still hanging around, Shorty?" Pedro sneered again, bouncing the ball lazily between his hands. "Why don't you go play with your dolls at home? This is for real players." The laughter erupted once more, echoing across the court, but Kaio didn't respond. He simply clutched the ball to his chest, turned around and walked away slowly, his footsteps echoing on the concrete as the dim light of the street lamp cast a small shadow across the ground. Hours later, the neighborhood had fallen silent, the streets empty and bathed in the pale light of the few working streetlights. The court was abandoned now, and as always, it was Kaio's time. This was when he came alive. While everyone else slept, he trained, dribbling and shooting beneath the flickering light, with no one around to judge or mock him. The rhythmic sound of the ball hitting the pavement was like music to his ears as he practiced his crossovers, dribbles, and shots. In his mind, he wasn't just a small kid on an empty court. He was playing in a championship game, dodging defenders and sinking impossible shots. Each move he made, he imagined his doubters standing in front of him, and with every successful shot, he felt a sense of triumph, even if no one was there to witness it. One day, Kaio muttered under his breath as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. "One day, they'll see." But as the hours dragged on, the doubt started creeping back in. His legs ached, his arms were tired, and each missed shot seemed louder in the silence, taunting him. The voices of the older boys echoed in his mind, reminding him of their harsh words. "Too small, too weak, you'll never make it." Kaio stopped dribbling for a moment, his hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. The doubt was suffocating. What if they were right? What if he really wasn't good enough? He had no fancy shoes, no professional coaching, just an old ball and a dream that seemed farther away with every missed shot. His thoughts wandered back to his father, the one person who had always believed in him. Kaio could still hear his voice, encouraging him, guiding him, even though he had been gone for years now. "Don't ever let them tell you what you can't do, Kaio," his father had always said. "You decide what you're capable of." A lump formed in Kaio's throat as he remembered those words. His father had been his biggest supporter, always telling him that he could make it, no matter what anyone said. Now, it was just him, but his father's words still lived inside him, pushing him to keep going. Kaio straightened up, picking up the ball again. His muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. He started dribbling again. Faster this time, the sound of the ball bouncing against the pavement echoing in the stillness of the night. Left, right crossover, shoot. Over and over, until the rhythm drowned out his doubts. One day, he repeated softly, the fire in his chest burning brighter. One day, I'll prove it. This chapter introduces Kaio's world, highlighting his struggles and the harsh reality he faces daily. It also deepens the emotional bond between him and his late father, showing how the memory of his father's encouragement fuels his determination. The loneliness of his training sessions contrasts with the desire to prove himself in front of the boys who constantly mock him. The sun was setting behind the rows of old buildings, casting long shadows over the streets. Kaio sat on a low wall just outside the court, the sound of sneakers screeching against the concrete filling the air. The older boys were playing again, their laughter mixing with the rhythm of the bouncing ball. It was the same routine. Every afternoon they played, while Kaio watched, waiting for a chance that never seemed to come. He gripped his ball tightly, feeling the worn leather under his fingers. His eyes followed their every movement. He knew he could keep up with them, maybe even beat them if given the chance. But every time he tried to join, they'd push him away. Too small, too weak. Go home, kid, they said. Each insult felt like a slap, but deep down, Kaio felt a fire burning. He had to prove them wrong. A loud shout brought him back to reality. One of the older boys, Lucas, had just made a three-pointer, and the others cheered, running to give him high fives. Kaio sighed, gripping the ball harder. How could they not see it? He wasn't just some small kid who didn't belong. He had talent. He trained every single day, hours spent in the shadows of the court, dribbling and shooting until his arms felt like they would fall off. But none of that mattered if no one ever saw him play. Kaio stood up and took a few steps toward the court. He was tired of being on the sidelines. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today they'd let him play. His heart raced as he approached. But before he could say anything, Pedro, one of the tallest boys, spotted him. "Look who's back," Pedro sneered, tossing the ball between his hands. "What? You still think you can play with us? Go home, shrimp. This is for real players." The other boys laughed as usual, and Kaio felt the familiar sting of humiliation rising in his chest. His grip on the ball tightened, but he didn't say a word. What was the point? Every time he opened his mouth, they just laughed harder. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was too small, too weak. But no matter how many times they shut him out, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant for more. "Hey, kid," Pedro called out again, a smirk crossing his face. "Maybe if you go home and grow a few feet, we'll think about it." The laughter echoed again, and Kaio felt the heat rising to his face. His fist clenched, the ball pressing against his chest, as if it could hold in the frustration building inside him. But instead of fighting back, he turned away, his steps heavy as he walked to the edge of the court. Later that night, under the pale light of the street lamp, Kaio returned to the now empty court. The streets were silent, save for the soft whisper of the wind in the court, so full of life just hours earlier, was his again. This was his sanctuary, his place of solitude. While everyone else slept, he trained. While the other boys laughed and mocked him, he worked on his skills. The sound of the ball bouncing echoed through the darkness as Kaio dribbled from side to side, his movements fluid and fast. He visualized Pedro in front of him, imagined dodging around him with a quick crossover, leaving him stunned. Then, a quick turn, a step back, and a shot. The ball flew through the air, and with a soft swish, it sailed perfectly through the hoop. He smiled, just for a moment, before grabbing the ball and repeating the same move. One day, he whispered to himself, out of breath but determined, one day they'll see. But as the hours passed, Doubt crept back in. His legs ached, his arms felt weak, and each missed shot seemed to mock him louder than the boys ever could. The small voice in the back of his mind, the one that told him he'd never be good enough, started to grow louder. No matter how much he practiced, how many hours he spent alone on the court, he was still the smallest kid. He was still the boy who got laughed at. Kaio stopped dribbling, resting his hands on his knees, his breath heavy. The doubt was suffocating. What if they were right? What if he wasn't cut out for this? He had no fancy shoes, no private coaching, no advantages. All he had was his ball and the dream of one day making it out of this place. His thoughts drifted back to his father. He could still hear his dad's voice, encouraging him, always telling him that he had potential. "Don't let them tell you who you are, Kaio," his father used to say. "You decide that." A lump formed in Kaio's throat, but he swallowed hard, refusing to let the tears come. His father was gone now, but his words still echoed in Kaio's heart. If there was one thing his father had taught him, it was that persistence always wins. Kaio knew that if he gave up now, he'd regret it forever. He couldn't let the laughter of a few boys stop him from chasing his dream. Straightening up, Kaio picked up the ball again. His arms felt like lead, but he started dribbling anyway. Left, right, crossover, shoot. Over and over, until the pain in his body was drowned out by the rhythm of the game. One day, he repeated softly, the fire in his chest burning brighter. One day, I'll prove it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood as the usual group of boys gathered at the court. Kaio watched from the sidelines as they played their usual game, laughing and joking between passes and shots. His heart raced as he gripped his ball, standing at a distance as he had done so many times before. But today felt different. Today, something inside him was urging him to act, to finally step onto that court and claim his place. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The voice of doubt tried to creep in, reminding him of all the times he had been laughed off the court, mocked for his size, dismissed before he even had the chance to play. But he pushed those thoughts aside. He had trained for this moment. This was his time. Kaio walked toward the court, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. The boys were in the middle of their game, but when they noticed him approaching, the ball stopped. "Well, look who it is," Pedro sneered, tossing the ball lazily to one of the other boys. "Shorty thinks he can play with the big boys." The others snickered, but Kaio didn't flinch. His hands tightened around his ball, his mind focused on what he had to do. He had practiced for this. Countless nights spent honing his skills. He had to believe in himself, even if no one else did. "I want to play," Kaio said firmly, his voice louder than it had ever been in front of them. He was tired of being silent, tired of watching from the sidelines. He needed to show them what he could do. Pedro looked him up and down, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "You want to play? Fine. We could use a good laugh." Kaio felt the sting of their laughter, but it only fueled his determination. He stepped onto the court, gripping the ball tightly. His pulse quickened as he positioned himself, his mind running through every move he had practiced. The game resumed, and Pedro, confident in his superiority, quickly passed the ball to another boy, ready to brush Kaio aside as if he were invisible. But when Kaio moved, everything changed. He darted across the court, faster than anyone expected, intercepting the ball with a quick swipe. The boys froze for a moment, their expressions shifting from amusement to surprise. Kaio didn't hesitate. With a swift dribble, he maneuvered around the first offender, leaving him stumbling behind. The court went quiet, save for the sound of the ball bouncing between Kaio's hands. He was in the zone now, every movement precise, every dribble controlled. As he approached the basket, Pedro charged at him, clearly determined to put him back in his place. Kaio didn't back down. With a quick crossover, he shifted to his left, then back to his right, confusing Pedro just long enough to slip past him. His heart raced as he took the shot, watching the ball soar through the air in slow motion. Swish. The ball slid through the hoop with ease, and the sound of it hitting the ground was the only noise in the otherwise silent court. Kaio stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as he looked around at the other boys. No one was laughing anymore. Pedro's face had lost its arrogant smirk, replaced with confusion and a hint of anger. The others exchanged stunned glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. For a moment, no one moved. Then Pedro scoffed, grabbing the ball and tossing it to one of his teammates. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, but there was a tightness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Let's see you do it again, Shorty." Kaio's blood was pumping, adrenaline surging through his veins. He wasn't going to stop now. He knew this was his moment. The ball came his way again, and this time, he moved with even more confidence. Every dribble felt lighter, every step quicker. He danced across the court, dodging defenders left and right, making passes, setting up shots. It was like the court had come alive beneath his feet. Each time he made a play, the silence grew heavier. The other boys were no longer jeering or making jokes. They were watching wide-eyed as Kaio took control of the game. His speed, his precision, his moves. None of them had expected this from the kid they had spent years mocking. Kaio was unstoppable. He weaved through the defenders like water flowing through rocks, and every shot he took was more confident than the last. By the time the game was nearing its end, the boys who once laughed at him now stood in awe. Kaio was no longer the small, invisible kid they could ignore. He had become the best player on the court. And then the moment of truth arrived. The score was tied with only seconds left on the clock. Pedro, frustrated and desperate to regain control, had the ball. He was determined to win, to prove that Kaio's success had been nothing more than a fluke. But Kaio wasn't about to let that happen. He kept his eyes on Pedro, reading every movement, anticipating his next move. When Pedro made his final push toward the basket, Kaio was ready. He darted forward, his body moving on instinct. With a swift, precise motion, he stole the ball cleanly from Pedro's hands. The crowd gasped. Kaio raced down the court, the noise of the spectators fading into the background. His focus was razor-sharp as he reached the three-point line, and without hesitation, he took the shot. The ball hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, and then swish. The game was over. Kaio had won. The silence that followed was deafening. The boys who had once ridiculed him now stood in stunned disbelief, their eyes wide as they tried to process what had just happened. Kaio, breathing heavily, felt the weight of all their doubt and laughter lift from his shoulders. He had done it. He had proven them all wrong. Slowly, the crowd began to clap. It started with a few hesitant hands, but soon the applause grew louder, filling the court with the sound of respect and admiration. Kaio stood in the middle of it all, the smallest player on the court, but in that moment, he felt like a giant. The crowd was still buzzing, stunned by what they had just witnessed. Kaio, the kid they had always mocked, had dominated the court. His heart was pounding, his body ached from the game, but none of that mattered. He had finally proven himself. As he stood there, drenched in sweat and catching his breath, the applause still echoing around him, Kaio felt something shift. For the first time, he wasn't just a small kid everyone underestimated. He was a player. But what he didn't know was that this moment was about to become even more significant than he had ever imagined. At the edge of the court, just beyond the fence, a man stood watching. He wasn't from the neighborhood. That much was clear. Dressed in casual clothes, but with an air of purpose, he leaned against the fence with his arms crossed, his eyes locked on Kaio. The boys playing hadn't noticed him, too absorbed in their shock over Kaio's performance. But the man hadn't missed a single move. He had been watching from the moment Kaio stepped onto the court. Kaio didn't notice the man at first. He was too caught up in the moment. Surrounded by boys who were now nodding their heads in respect, some even patting him on the back. The boys who had once laughed at him were now looking at him with something close to awe. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Kaio spotted the man. He was standing quietly, but there was something in his posture that caught Kaio's attention. He seemed different, like he wasn't just another spectator. As the crowd began to thin out and the boys drifted away, still murmuring in disbelief about what had happened, the man made his move. He stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate as he approached Kaio. "Hey, kid," the man called out, his voice calm but authoritative. Kaio turned, his body still buzzing with the adrenaline of the game. He saw the man coming closer, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. Who was this guy? Why was he here? The man didn't look like the kind of person who just wandered around the neighborhood courts. The man stopped a few feet away from Kaio, his eyes studying him carefully. There was something sharp in his gaze, something that made Kaio feel like he was being evaluated. "You got some serious talent, kid," the man said, nodding toward the hoop. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" Kaio blinked, still trying to process what was happening. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, with admiration in their voice. I just practice," Kaio mumbled, suddenly feeling self-conscious. The man smiled slightly, as if he already knew the answer. "Practice, huh? Well, whatever you're doing, it's working." He extended a hand. "I'm Joao, by the way. I'm a scout for the Youth Basketball League." "A scout?" The words hit Kaio like a punch to the gut. He stared at Joao's hand for a moment, too stunned to move. "A scout? Here?" Talking to him, it felt surreal, like this was something that only happened to other people, not to kids like him. After a second, Kaio shook Joao's hand, his mind still racing. "You're a scout," he repeated, as if saying it out loud would help him believe it. Joao nodded. "That's right. I've been scouting talent for years now. I was in the area today for something else. But then I saw your game." He paused, glancing back at the court. "And let me tell you, what you did out there, that's special." Kaio felt his chest tighten, his breath coming a little faster. Was this real? Could this actually be happening? He had dreamed about moments like this, but he had never really believed they could come true. Joao seemed to sense Kaio's disbelief and smiled again, a little more warmly this time. "I'm not kidding, kid. You've got something. The way you move, the way you handle the ball, it's not something you see every day. With the right training, you could go far." Kaio's head was spinning. All the nights spent practicing alone, all the times he had been mocked and pushed aside, it had all led to this moment. A real scout, someone who could help him get out of this neighborhood and into something bigger, had seen him, really seen him. "What do you say?" Joao asked, his voice steady. "You interested in taking this to the next level? I've got connections with some great coaches, and I think they'd love to work with you." For a moment, Kaio couldn't find his voice. He had always dreamed of playing basketball professionally, but the dream had seemed so far away, so impossible. Now, with Joao standing in front of him, offering him a way out, it suddenly felt real, tangible. But then, doubt crept back in. Could he really do this? Was he good enough? He was just a small kid from a poor neighborhood. The boys at the court had always told him he'd never make it. Could he prove them wrong? Not just today, but for good? Joao must have seen the uncertainty in Kaio's eyes, because he stepped forward and put a hand on Kaio's shoulder. "Look," he said, his voice softer now. "I know this seems big, and yeah, it's not going to be easy. You'll have to work harder than you've ever worked before. But I can tell you this, you've got what it takes." I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that. Kaio swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It was a lot to take in, but deep down, he knew this was his chance. The chance he had been waiting for. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. "I want to do it." Joao's smile widened, and he gave Kaio a firm nod. "Good. I'll get things set up. We'll start training soon." As Joao turned to leave, Kaio stood frozen for a moment, watching him walk away. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. This was really happening. His dream. The dream he had held on to for so long, even when it felt impossible, was finally within reach. For the first time, Kaio allowed himself to imagine a different future. A future where he wasn't just a kid who played basketball in the neighborhood. He was going to be something more. And for the first time, he believed it. The days after Kaio's encounter with Joao felt like a whirlwind. One moment, he was just a small kid fighting for a chance to play on the street court. The next, he was being introduced to a world he had only dreamed of. Joao had kept his word, setting up meetings with coaches, organizing training sessions, and connecting Kaio with people who had once felt so distant, so out of reach. The first day at the training facility was unlike anything Kaio had ever experienced. The court was spotless. The rims were shiny, and the entire place buzzed with energy and professionalism. No cracked concrete, no rusty hoops. Everything was perfect. As he stepped onto the smooth wooden floor, Kaio felt a mix of excitement and nerves. This wasn't just a playground anymore. This was where the real work began. The other players on the court were older and more experienced. They moved with precision, their shots clean and crisp, their passes fast and accurate. Kaio watched them with wide eyes, feeling like he had entered an entirely new world. The raw street talent he had relied on now seemed out of place among these finely tuned athletes. "Hey, new kid!" One of the taller players called out as Kaio stepped onto the court. "You the one Joao's been talking about?" Kaio nodded, trying to hide the nerves swirling in his stomach. "Yeah, that's me." The player raised an eyebrow, glancing down at Kaio's worn-out sneakers and scrawny frame. "You sure you're in the right place?" The question stung, but Kaio had grown used to that kind of doubt. He had heard it all before, from the boys in his neighborhood who didn't believe in him. But this was different. This was a higher level, and now he had to prove himself all over again. The first few practices were brutal. The drills were harder than anything Kaio had ever done, the pace faster, the competition fiercer. The other players weren't interested in being friendly. They were there to compete, to fight for their own spots on teams and in leagues. Kaio could feel their eyes on him, judging him, waiting for him to fail. And at times, it felt like he might. His muscles ached like never before, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed himself to keep up. The coaches shouted commands, their voices sharp as they demanded more from every player. Kaio stumbled through some of the drills, his body still adjusting to the intensity. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that maybe he wasn't cut out for this after all. Maybe he didn't belong here, surrounded by players who had been training like this their whole lives. But every time that voice tried to take over, Kaio remembered the court back home. He remembered the laughter, the taunts, the disbelief in everyone's eyes. He had come too far to give up now. This was his shot, his chance to be something more than just a kid from the neighborhood, and he wasn't going to waste it. After a particularly grueling practice, Kaio collapsed onto the bench, drenched in sweat, his body screaming for rest. The other players had already left the court, but Kaio stayed behind, watching the empty hoop. His mind was racing, replaying every mistake he had made during the session. Every missed shot, every stumble. He knew he could do better. He had to do better. As he sat there, Joao walked over, his face calm but serious. He had been watching Kaio from the sidelines, studying his progress closely. "You're working hard," Joao said, sitting down next to Kaio on the bench. "But you're still doubting yourself, aren't you?" Kaio didn't answer right away. He stared down at his hands, which were still shaking from the intensity of the practice. "I don't know if I'm good enough," he admitted quietly. "Everyone here, they're faster, stronger. It's like they've been doing this their whole lives." Joao nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "They have. But that doesn't mean you don't belong here." He leaned forward, looking Kaio directly in the eyes. "You've got something that a lot of these guys don't have. You've got heart. I've seen it. You're not just playing for yourself. You're playing to prove something. And that's what's going to push you further than any of them." Kaio swallowed hard, the weight of Joao's words settling over him. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted him, but this time felt different. This time, the stakes were higher, the challenge bigger. You're going to feel out of place for a while, Joao continued. That's normal, but you've got to trust in what brought you here. You've got talent, Kaio, and you've got the drive to succeed. If you didn't, I wouldn't have wasted my time on you. Kaio looked up, meeting Joao's gaze. There was no doubt in Joao's eyes, no hint of uncertainty. Joao believed in him, believed in his potential, and that belief, more than anything, gave Kaio the strength to keep going. The next day, Kaio arrived at the gym early. Before anyone else had even shown up, he was already on the court, practicing his dribbling, his shooting, his footwork. He repeated every drill from the day before, determined to master each one. The pain in his muscles was still there, but he pushed through it, his mind focused on the goal ahead. Little by little, he started to improve. His shots became more consistent, his movements more fluid. The other players began to notice, too. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't questioning whether he belonged. They were starting to see him as a real competitor. The transition wasn't easy. Kaio still faced moments of doubt, still stumbled through some drills. But he kept pushing, kept fighting for every inch of progress. He knew that this was just the beginning, and the road ahead would only get tougher. But he also knew that he had the strength to make it through. As the weeks passed, Kaio grew stronger, faster, more confident. The coaches started giving him more attention, noticing the strides he was making. He wasn't just the underdog anymore. He was becoming a real player. And with every practice, every shot, Kaio was one step closer to the dream that had once seemed impossible. Months had passed since Kaio's first day at the training facility, and the transformation was undeniable. What once felt foreign and intimidating had become second nature. The court, the drills, the intensity, it all felt like home now. Kaio had grown, not just physically but mentally. He was faster, stronger, and more skilled, but most importantly, he was confident in his abilities. The other players had long stopped questioning whether he belonged. Kaio had earned their respect the hard way, through sweat, perseverance, and sheer determination. He wasn't the smallest kid on the court anymore. He was a competitor, a rising talent who demanded attention every time he touched the ball. But there was still one thing Kaio hadn't experienced yet, a real competition. The training had been intense, but there was something different about stepping into an actual game, where everything was on the line. That day was finally here. The buzz of excitement filled the air as Kaio stood on the sidelines of a packed gymnasium, his new team warming up for their first game in the youth league. The roar of the crowd, the bright lights overhead. It was everything Kaio had dreamed of and more. His heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and nerves, but this time, the doubt was gone. He knew he belonged here. Joao had been in the stands since the warm-up, watching as Kaio moved with a focus and determination that hadn't been there when they first met. He wasn't the unsure kid who questioned whether he could make it anymore. Kaio had transformed, and Joao couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. "You ready, kid?" Joao called out from the sidelines as Kaio jogged past him. Kaio smiled, his chest swelling with confidence. More than ready. The whistle blew, signaling the start of the game, and Kaio felt his heart race as he took his position on the court. This was it, the moment he had worked for, the moment he had dreamed about for so long. Everything he had been through, every hardship, every doubt, it had all led to this. From the first play, Kaio knew he had to bring everything he had. The opposing team was tough, skilled, and aggressive, but Kaio had faced bigger obstacles before. He darted across the court, his movements precise and calculated. Every dribble, every pass, every shot, it was as if the countless hours of practice were playing out in perfect rhythm. Midway through the first quarter, Kaio found himself in a one-on-one situation with the opposing team's star player. The crowd leaned forward, anticipating the battle that was about to unfold. The opposing player towered over Kaio, his size and strength intimidating. But Kaio wasn't afraid. He faked left, then crossed over to his right, leaving his defender stumbling as he sliced through the defense. The crowd erupted in cheers as Kaio pulled up for a mid-range jumper, the ball flying through the air in a perfect arc. Swish. The crowd roared, and Kaio's teammates rushed to slap him on the back. But Kaio barely registered the noise. He was in the zone, fully locked in on the game. This was where he belonged. This was what he was made for. As the game wore on, Kaio's impact became undeniable. He wasn't just holding his own, he was dominating. His quick reflexes, sharp passing, and deadly accuracy made him a nightmare for the opposing team. Every time he touched the ball, the crowd held its breath, waiting for the next moment of brilliance. By the time the final whistle blew, Kaio's team had won by a wide margin. The scoreboard flashed brightly, but all Kaio could feel was a rush of victory coursing through his veins. He had done it, his first real game, and he had proven that he was more than just a kid from the neighborhood court. He was a player, a real player. As the team celebrated their victory, Joao made his way down from the stands, a broad smile on his face. He found Kaio amidst the crowd, who was grinning from ear to ear, his eyes still wide with disbelief at what had just happened. "Not bad for your first game," Joao said, clapping Kaio on the shoulder. "You made it look easy out there." Kaio laughed, still catching his breath. "I've never felt anything like that before." Joao nodded. "That's because you're doing what you were meant to do. You've worked hard for this, Kaio. You deserve it." Kaio looked out over the court, the cheers still ringing in his ears, and for the first time, he let himself truly believe it. He had earned this moment. He had worked through every doubt, every challenge, every setback, and now he was seeing the fruits of his labor. But even as he soaked in the victory, Kaio knew that this was just the beginning. There were more games ahead, more challenges, more opportunities to grow. The road wouldn't always be easy, but now he knew something he hadn't fully believed before. He was capable of making it. He could handle whatever came next. A few weeks later, back in the neighborhood, Kaio returned to the court where it had all started. The rusty fences and cracked pavement looked different now, smaller somehow. It was strange to think that not long ago, this place had been the center of his world. Now, after everything that had happened, it felt like a distant memory. The neighborhood boys were playing their usual game, and when they spotted Kaio walking toward the court, they stopped, eyes widening in recognition. "Kaio's back," one of them whispered. "Isn't he playing in the league now?" The boys who had once mocked him now stared in awe. Kaio smiled, feeling a mix of pride and nostalgia. He wasn't here to show off. He was here to remind himself of where he came from. The court, the taunts, the nights spent practicing alone, it had all led him here. One of the younger boys, no older than 10, approached him, clutching a basketball tightly. "Can you teach me how to play like you?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with admiration. Kaio smiled and nodded, taking the ball from the boy's hands. He dribbled a few times, the familiar rhythm of the ball against the pavement bringing back memories of all the nights he had spent here, chasing a dream that had once felt so far away. "Let's start with the basics," Kaio said, tossing the ball back to the boy. "And remember, don't let anyone tell you that you can't do it. You decide how far you go.